So today I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about a section from Peter Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread. This particular section is in chapter 6 of the book, and it describes some of the reasons that we attribute value to housing. And this particular section was probably the section that hit me hardest when I read the book. It's influenced me the most at how I've seen economics change from my perspective. And I think it's a really important section that I don't hear spoken about a lot. Um, so, because it has a personal value to me and because it's influenced me greatly, I kind of wanted to take the little bit of time to read the quote, to go over kind of what Kropotkin's trying to say with it, and kind of add my perspective and how it's influenced me, and, just throw it out there and see what everybody thinks. So, pulling up the quote we have here, "The house was not built by its owner. It was erected, decorated, and furnished by innumerable workers. In the lumber yard, in the brick field, and the workshop, toiling for dear life at minimum wage. The money spent to the owner was not the product of his own toil. It was amassed, like all other riches, by paying the workers 2/3 or only half of what was their due. Moreover, and it is here that the enormity of the whole proceeding becomes most glaring, the house owes its actual value to the profit which the owner can make out of it. Now this profit results from the fact that this house is built in a town, possessing bridges, quays, and fine public buildings, and affording to its inhabitants 1,000 comforts and conveniences, unknown in villages, a town well paved, lighted with gas, in regular communication with other towns, and itself a center of industry, commerce, science, and art. A town which the work of 20 or 30 generations has gone to render habitable, healthy, and beautiful. A house in certain parts of Paris may be valued at thousands of pounds sterling, not because thousands of pounds worth of labor have been expended on that particular house, but because it is in Paris. Because for centuries worksmen, artists, thinkers, and men of learning and letters have contributed to make Paris what it is today. A center of industry, commerce, politics, art, and science. Because Paris has a past. Because thanks to literature, the names of its streets, and household words in foreign countries, as well as at home. Because it is the fruit of 18 centuries of toil, the work of 50 generations of the whole French nation. Who then can appropriate to himself the tiniest plot of ground or the meanest building without committing a flagrant injustice? Who then has the right to sell to any bidder the smallest portion of the common heritage?" So what Kropotkin's getting out there, from my perspective, is that when you own a piece of property, a home or whatever, what actually is contributing to the value of that home? Is it the land? No, we can't say it's the land because on that land is a house. And so is it the house that's on that land? No, we can't really say that because if we took an identical house in a major city, let's say a city like Paris, which is what he says, and you took it from the countryside, those houses are likely to have two very different values. The same plot of land is probably worth different values between Paris and a rural area. You see the same kind of thing in the United States all the time. Values of homes in major cities like Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York City, those places are much more expensive, where you can have an apartment in one of those cities cost more than a large home in a more decentralized location or in a more rural area. So what you're actually paying for when you own a home, or if you're renting a home and you're paying a landlord for the value of that space, that landlord isn't just selling you the value of the home. Maybe, if you have a one-bedroom apartment, you're not getting just a one-bedroom apartment. You're getting a one-bedroom apartment in a city that has infrastructure, that has culture, that has identity, that has resources, that has a history attached to it. And because of that, you end up in a situation where you're paying the landlord, or if you actually own the place, you've paid for part of the history of that particular piece of land. And because of that, you're buying something that the seller doesn't really own or the landlord doesn't really own if you really look at it and examine it. Like, how can you say that you own a piece of time? How can you say that you own a piece of history that you're extracting from not only the laborers who built the house, not only the people who have owned it and maintained it before you, but also the cultural infrastructure and identity around that home. So when we really examine this particular section from Kropotkin, he's kind of advocating for the valuelessness of homes. He's saying that it's communally owned, that one cannot own a home in Paris, because if you own a home in Paris, you own a piece of its culture, identity, heritage, and history. And I think that having read this, I ended up trying to apply it to a lot of aspects of life, right? Like, when we say that we own even the most basic things, like in this day and age, I don't think it's outrageous to think of a cell phone, right? Like, most people own cell phones in the United States. I know that's not going outward to the rest of the world all the time, but most people in the United States have a cell phone. But that with that cell phone, there's a history to it. There's a culture, there's an identity. What made the cell phone happen? There's a history of a huge line of telecommunication and other industries that came together to make that phone. And so on a technological level, we can also examine a cultural history. And I don't even know how one would think about like owning a particular phone. Like, that particular phone might be something that you could say is yours, right? Like, you could buy a particular phone, but all of the technologies that went up to that have become part of, I don't know, a common heritage of people. We can't really imagine having a cell phone without having the rotary phone. We can't imagine having a cell phone without having the digital cordless phone. Every technology has stepped forward and made one thing lead to another. And we get that in literature and art stuff, right? We get common domain, where after a while, because the person who made a certain thing has sort of a right in capitalism to own their particular works for a period of time, when they pass on, the idea is that it becomes part of the cultural identity of the society. And while Disney has advocated very strongly against that over the years and has made copyright laws a complete nightmare, and I know there's other companies involved, but Disney's kind of like the big one. Technically speaking, we should be examining a lot of those things in quite the same way. Like, they are part of a common identity of a certain culture, and they enter into the public domain so that everybody can use them, so that they become the narrative of a group of people or a nation or what have you. And when you apply this across the board, it doesn't really make sense to think of ownership outside of one's personal property, to think of it as anything but the collectives, because everybody has had a history of putting into it. And I think it also speaks very much to like the United States' history, especially when we talk about topics like who actually owns a lot of the wealth in this country. A lot of the wealth that's currently owned in this country is by people who made money off of laborers, but also people who made money off of slaves, who didn't get any of the value and return of their work. So when you're not just looking at the value of work, but the value of a communal heritage, everything kind of loses its sense of value. It kind of takes on this humanistic thing where everybody has a right and access to that culture and identity. if you are in a city that has trains, that has public works, that has parks, that has all these things, we generally think of those as relatively publicly accessible, even if you do have to pay like a fee to use the subway to maintain it or something. And I know that that gets really complicated because privatization and all that. But when you really get down to it, the subway, or a mass transit system, those things improve the value of a city. They improve the value of homes that are nearby that public transit. Uh, Places with great waterworks or better internet or other utilities generally are valued higher than places that don't have those things. So you are not getting to own just the piece of property that you live on, not just the home that you live on, the space that you're living in, but you're owning a portion of the entire public works and what goes into that. And I don't know if you do have a right to buy and sell that. I don't know if that's something that we should be looking more into over time. Um, and like I said, I think it applies a lot more broadly than just housing. I think that it can go a lot further than that. And I know that this is just like the start of a conversation, the start of a thought process. It's not really the conclusion, right? Like, I couldn't tell you, like, how should we divvy everything up? How should we understand the basic needs of the Commonwealth? But this speaks to this very anarchist perspective that maybe we should be looking at things much more communally. Maybe we should be looking at an understanding that both the good and bad aspects of our histories come together and culminate in a story that leads us to everything right now. Everything is the ownership of the story and narrative of history. And, maybe we need to examine it from that perspective instead of looking at it at this very private ownership level where we demand that people who have inherited wealth and own things get to just keep it. Maybe they don't have the same rights to it that we think they do. And I know that's going to anger a lot of people. I know that's a very scary proposition. And I'm not sitting here advocating that we rip people from their homes or that we do something terrifying like take away, a person's personal, memento, or take away even their basic, tools that they use in their everyday lives, like their phone and their laptop. But what I'm advocating is let's start thinking of a lot of the things that we own as more of a communal property and start thinking of the private property aspect of things, especially when we deal with land ownership, landlords, etc., as an institution that takes advantage of the collective works of not just laborers, but artists, philanthropists, socialites, everything down the line, including other capitalists, right? Like the industry that's in cities, that was in cities, that made them happen. You think of a city like Pittsburgh and how the waters were polluted through the steel mills that were down there, and how the city is still trying to clean that up to this day. And as they clean it up, values of homes increase. That is a legacy that is controlled outside of the control of the actual homeowner and the land. So maybe we should be looking at cities as collective spaces in some regard. And with that, I hope that this dialogue continues. I hope we create a conversation around this. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.